Hello everyone, welcome to the fifth of our Reconnect webinar series. I'm Alexander Moylan from the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating this webinar on Poland's Constitutional Breakdown, a book recently published with Oxford University Press by Professor Wojciech Sadurski, who we're very glad to welcome to our webinar series, and who is joining us all the way from Sydney, Australia, as well as Professor Paul Blokker, who participated in the very first Reconnect webinar and is joining us again today. Wojciech is the Challis Professor in Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney and Professor at the Centre for Europe at the University of Warsaw. Between 1999 and 2009, he was Professor of Legal Theory and Philosophy of Law at the European University Institute in Florence. And he is Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, as well as board member of the Institute of Public Affairs, Freedom of the Press Observatory, and the Centre for International Affairs, all based in Poland. Since 2011, he is also chairman of the Academic Advisory Board of the Community of Democracies. It should also be mentioned that as a result of his criticism of the ruling Law and Justice Party in Poland, Professor Sadurski has also been subjected to serious legal harassment in his home country, where the government and the state-run broadcaster in 2019 have initiated 3 civil cases against him. So we're particularly grateful that you are with us today to discuss your important contribution to the academic debate on the rule of law. Paul Blokker is Associate Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bologna. He graduated in Political Science from the University of Amsterdam, and he holds a doctorate from the European University Institute. His research interests include the sociology of constitutional law and of human rights, constitutional change, constitutional and political imaginaries, civic participation and populism, in particular in the context of East and Central Europe. Finally, as many of you already know, he is one of the principal investigators in our Reconnect project. So welcome back to our webinar series. Before we start, allow me to say a few words about the Reconnect project, for those of you who are still not familiar with it. Reconnect is a 4-year multidisciplinary research project funded by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020 program. It brings together 18 academic partners from across Europe and aims at reconciling Europe with its citizens through democracy and the rule of law. So the goal that we have set ourselves is to explain and provide solutions to the deepening disconnect between the Union and its citizens in the context of recent crises, such as the challenges of migration, the economy, and security. Our audience will also be aware that the European Court of Justice just yesterday ruled that Poland has violated EU law as well as the independence of its courts by enacting a controversial reform to its Supreme Court, lowering retirement age of its judges, which makes our conversation here today all the more topical. Now, the general structure of this webinar is as follows. First, Professor Sadurski will briefly introduce his book, then Paul will share with us his reflections, and Professor Sadurski will have the opportunity to reply. During the presentations, you may send your questions to me via the webinar chat box, which you can access from the control panel. After the presentations, I will bring your thoughts and questions into the discussion and allow both Professor Sadurski and Paul to respond. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to Professor Sadurski and very much look forward to his presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex. And first of all, I would like to thank the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and in particular for the Reconnect project for hosting this webinar. I would like to thank you and the whole team of the Leuven Center. I would like to thank Professor Paul Blokker, whom I have known for quite a long time and admired his work, for agreeing to comment. And of course, I would like to thank all the participants of the webinar. I will not be spending much time now in introducing this book of mine, because I would like to leave time both for Paul and for the participants. So in these few minutes of the introduction, I would like first to say what the book is about, and the second, what were my main problems or dilemmas in writing this book. So first, what is the book about? I have three main aspirations, or I have had three main aspirations when writing this book. First of all, to give as detailed and accurate account of what has been actually going on. So to put certain things on record. You know, we read newspapers, we need academic journals, we occasionally read books. And we have those traces of information about this country in Central Europe, a very large country, a very important country, which was a few years ago considered to be one of the pioneers of democratic consolidation after the fall of communism, and then something bad happened. And I tried to say what it is. So it's, if you like, a physiognomy of the event. The second point I'm trying to do, and my second aspiration, is to offer some explanations about why it happened. What were the root causes of it? What were the conditions within which such a strange turnaround of a certain trajectory, which seems to be relatively determinate, suddenly altered, and the unexpected, at least to many of us, has happened. And the third aspiration is the thinnest of all, unfortunately. And yet, I cannot avoid it, and I'm trying to say, what is the way out? Considering, as I do, that what has happened in Poland over the last 4 years is quite tragic, can we find some reasons for optimism? Are there any democratic resources in today's Poland on which we, people committed to freedom, promoting democracy, may count? So this is what the book is about. And I had two main problems in writing this book, and I should disclose them before I pass on to Paul. My first problem is I'm writing this book, as the Latin maxim goes, in medias res, in the middle of the developments, which are by no means finished. I have finished this book at the end of 2018. That's the sequence of academic publishing, and I'm still very, very grateful to Oxford University Press that they managed to sort of fast track it. And I have decided that I will need to put an ending point at the beginning of November last year. But many things happened since then. And many things will happen, many things happened even yesterday, as you, Alex, mentioned. Many things happened today and tomorrow and in 1 month's time. So I had to put a rather arbitrary point at which I finish my narrative, knowing full well that on the day that the first readers will get this book on their desks, in some ways it will be out of date. Well, that's the problem that every non-historian, but a person writing about current events, faces. I do hope that there are some more universal lessons in this book which are relatively insensitive to day-to-day changes. And my second point, my second problem is more of an emotional one, and that is, I'm a Pole. I'm a Polish national. Although I've spent much of my time, perhaps most of my professional time, outside Poland, I've never been outside Poland in any intellectual and emotional way. So for me, in contrast to a number of other lawyers or comparative lawyers or political scientists who write about a particular region or case, Poland is not just, quote unquote, a case. Poland is my country, to which I am attached, and which I love. So it was very hard for me to draw a distinction between my role as a dispassionate analyst and my role as a concerned citizen. So my formula is, this book, I hope, is accurate. It is as accurate as I could hope to write. But it's not neutral. It's not impartial in the sense that I have certain values, I have certain preferences about what has happened and what should happen, and I'm not trying to hide them. Okay, let me finish this introduction at that.
Thank you very much, and I think that already gives us a good sense of how important your contribution is and how crucial this story is when making sense of rule of law and democratic backsliding in the EU, and also of the challenges that you faced in tackling this topic. Now, Paul, please, you have the floor. You may go ahead with your comments, and then we will go back to Professor Sadurski.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I thank the Reconnect project, the Leuven Center, but also in particular, of course, Wojciech Sadurski for allowing me to comment on his very timely and extremely comprehensive and interesting book. I think this is an excellent moment for having a book like this available. As far as I'm aware, there's not yet such a detailed study, in particular in the Polish case, but of course, what makes the book even more important is that Poland is not the only cumbersome situation. And that might perhaps exactly shed some light on my own position. I'm not Polish, I'm Dutch. I care perhaps less about my home country than Wojciech does, but I do care about what is going on in Poland. And so my remarks will be particularly along the line of not merely about how can we rescue Poland, but rather in from the perspective of how can we perceive what is going on in Poland as perhaps part of a wider trend, while at the same time being part of very specific Polish issues and trends and developments. I will not so much focus on the technical details and peculiarities of the Polish case. I think this book is almost exhaustive in what has happened at least until November last year in Poland, and so in that sense I don't have anything to add. I guess I just learned an awful lot of what Wojciech Sadurski has so carefully documented, and so my comments are rather going into the direction of what also Wojciech himself indicates in the book itself as part of a broader analysis of what Wojciech calls anti-constitutionalist populist backsliding. And so I'm interested particularly in that broader perspective. And so that also means that the dimensions that I'm going to touch upon are not necessarily forms of critique on the book, but they are attempts to push the debate further, to argue that even if we know all this about what happened in terms of political actions, in terms of anti-constitutional actions, I think we still need further reflection also on a number of wider dimensions that perhaps help us to understand better what has been going on the ground, so to speak. The first element is, and there it's really not a critique of the book, because I think chapter 2 is an essential chapter. It's a historical chapter. It discusses the period roughly of 1989 until 2015, and I think without this precursor, we wouldn't really understand very much of the sort of the law and justice counter-revolution, or whatever you want to call it. So I think this is extremely important, and Wojciech also for instance, indicates what one could see as the historical dimensions to backsliding. One reason of why we want to be talking about backsliding is because it drags into the debate a temporal dimension. I think that's extremely important. I think Wojciech's account is mostly portraying how early choices, often contingent choices dictated by the events of the day in around 1989, the events afterwards, the Round Table, etc., how they played out in the Constitution of 1997 itself. I think that's a very valuable argument, and it convinces me all the way through. But I wonder if there are not other aspects that we should be trying to think about further. One issue is, and I'm currently involved in a special issue project with historians about one aspect I think is really important is how do we understand, or perhaps I should reformulate this as, shouldn't we reassess the role of socialist legality, and particularly the events from the 1970s onwards? So in very simple terms, this would mean to say it's not only the dissidents, it's not only Solidarność, it's not only Charta 77 that started promoting a certain vision of the law that was in tension, in strong tension with socialist legality, but also formal communist parties started introducing constitutional legal instruments. And I wonder if we shouldn't be reflecting on this more. Has this some kind of implications for what happened after 1989? Might it be that the Constitutional Tribunal is in some ways tainted because it was set up before 1989, even if it didn't have any of the robust constitutional review roles that it gained afterwards? So that's one question that is, in a way, it's simply a intellectual curiosity in a way, but it might have further implications. And also looking into debates on the communist history of Poland, like for instance the work of Sulikowski, indicates, and I think Wojciech does it in the book too, that certain understandings of the constitution in the socialist communist era are strikingly similar to the perceptions of law and justice with regard to constitutional justice. So a formal attachment to parliamentary supremacy, which in reality means a one-party state. Well, I think a one-party state would be an interesting description of Poland nowadays. And so I think that might be important to think and reflect on think about this and reflect on this further. A second issue that I think is extremely important is the constitution-making process itself. From the early 1990s onwards, Wojciech very accurately, I think, describes how this was a kind of prolonged process, but throughout the 1990s, we could actually argue that important constitutional institutions were actually already in place, even if there wasn't yet a full-blown new constitution. But still, I think it might be important to think about, does this prolonged constitutional moment, if you would want to call it like that, does that make a difference? And it's not perhaps a coincidence that Hungary, in a very different way, equally has a prolonged constitutional moment with its post-1989 constitution, basically a series of amendments, with this first phrase about that it was an interim constitution. But a more important point, I think, is the constitution-making moment itself, and particularly the adoption of the 1997 constitution. It seems to me, looking at important work that analyzes debate itself, that the compromise, on the one hand, can, as Wojciech says very rightly so, be seen as the Polish contribution to world constitutionalism, and I think I've referred to that myself in my own work, but with the benefit of the hindsight, it could also be seen as a very fragile compromise. And it de facto excluded those forces that are now in power and that now claim to be, claim that that 1997 compromise was actually highly problematic and it never really responded to ideas in wider society. Whether that is accurate or not is a second issue, of course. And so I would argue that those dimensions, those historical dimensions, might need more reflection. It's not saying that Wojciech could have done that in this book. It was already a long read. It would have become even longer. But to sum this historical point up, it seems to me that there are a couple of dimensions that derive from this that we should reflect more on. So if there is a longer historical trend that points to the current counter-revolution, how does that relate, for instance, to the mobilization of parts of society? How does it relate to a certain kind of orientation of the current regime towards a kind of conservative project? How does it relate to forms of legitimacy? And I'm particularly thinking of sociological forms of legitimacy here. And also, how does it relate to a certain kind of attempt to form international alliances with like-minded forces? And as I said, I'm not as involved as Wojciech is, because he's a Pole and I'm not. But of course, I live in Italy, and I have great concerns about the future of Italy. And so I see certain overlaps with claims being made by the different governments involved. Okay, so that's the historical point. A second point I would like to make, and it's something I try to work on with the Polish scholar myself, is the aspect of civil society. I think Wojciech very rightly claims in the book on many occasions that one lesson we can draw from these forms of backsliding is that hardware institutions like constitutions, like independent courts, etc., themselves are not able to withstand strong attacks. And so one element that is extremely important, I think, and I think Wojciech says it himself too, is how, to what extent are these institutions embedded, you might say, in a kind of Polanyian language, in wider society? I do feel that Wojciech pays a lot of attention to civil society in the book, in particular also in terms of the very problematic laws that Law and Justice has adopted with regard to the right of assembly and so on and so forth. But I wonder, wouldn't it be extremely important to look more carefully and more systematically at what I would call constitutional resistance, forms of resistance against the constitutional takeover by the Law and Justice Party, even if it doesn't even have a constitutional majority, as we know. And so I wondered why there's very little discussion ultimately of actors like the Committee for Defense of Democracy, but also the quite many instances of protest on the street, but also organized on a horizontal way, in a way, in civil society, which is one of the main differences, I think, that divides Hungary from Poland. Hungary has that much less. And if we look at a wider region, let's think of last weekend in Prague. What happened there? Enormous amount of people on the streets for issues that are not unrelated to what is going on in Poland. And you could say similar things for Romania. So I wonder if we accept and recognize that one of the biggest problems of the liberal legal constitutional project is that it might not become embedded in wider society, shouldn't we then reflect in a more systemic and perhaps comparative manner into what that then means? Kim Scheppele has made similar arguments in a book that I co-edited on sociological constitutionalism. A second dimension there is, this is the darker part of the story, shouldn't we have also much more attention for uncivil society? Looking at this aspect, it seems to me that the striking overlap between the Polish and Hungarian cases is a certain form of mobilization of conservative forces since the early 90s, and actually already earlier, and Solidarność is a case in point, of course, around not a homogeneous, but around different points of view of a conservative understanding of Polish society. And I think this might have played a very important role in supporting this type of counter-constitutional revolution in Poland. Getting to a third point, and I couldn't sort of leave this point out because at a certain stage, I think it's in the last chapter in the book, Wojciech refers to the issue of Polish political constitutionalism, and my name is dragged into debate, and I feel a need to defend myself. But that's not the main point I want to make here. The main point I want to make is that I feel that Wojciech perhaps downplays the importance of a critical, comparativist reflection and analysis of what constitutionalism is and how it institutionalizes in actual societal situation. Getting to the personal point in a way, I find it unfortunate that in a certain way somebody misinterprets my work and then some other scholar follows that misinterpretation and falls into the same trap. To make it very clear, I never equated Poland with political constitutionalism. I think that is wrong. Adam Stanota does that in a Verfassungsblog piece, but the day after, I published a piece on that very same blog saying that I don't agree with that interpretation. And on top of that is, where does this come from? In my book, New Democracies in Crisis, there's a chapter that Adam has actually called a fairly boring chapter, and that might be the case, but it's a chapter that attempts to identify theoretically a number of manifestations of what constitutionalism is. And I think this might be boring and it might be pedantic or whatever, but I think this is important. Because what does that chapter try to do? It tries to say there are different normative theoretical positions on constitutionalism, and by studying these, we can understand what kind of range of criticisms do there exist on legal constitutionalism. My argument in that book is, I don't side with political constitutionalism. To me, political constitutionalism is something that looks at the past. My argument is, we need liberal constitutionalism, but we need to democratize it much further. That might mean sacrificing a very robust form of constitutional review. But it doesn't mean getting rid of it per se. It means just that the institutional structure is more powerfully linked to forces in society, to participation, to forms of deliberative mini publics and stuff like that.
Paul, might I ask you to perhaps we can give the floor back to Wojciech, and then we can continue the discussion also with the audience. Shall we do it like this? I think there's plenty of food for thought.
Okay. Is it okay if I make 3 very quick last points and then I've done my my tour de force? It will take me 2 minutes or so. Is that okay?
Okay, very quick.
Okay, so the 3 other points I had to make. First of all, Wojciech says that the the Law and Justice project is only thinly ideological. But I feel in the light of work of scholars who work on conservatism in Poland, I wonder whether that's true. I wonder if we can see more robust linkages with some kind of conservative ideological mindset. Then a further point would be on illiberal democracy. I wonder if we should simply juxtapose liberal and illiberal democracy. My position would be, and that also relates to my final point, is that we have to accept, I think, as a matter of fact, that liberal democracy is in a very dire situation. So we have to think about that. And just going back to a kind of status quo ex ante, which juxtaposes the well-functioning liberal democracy to an illiberal democracy as a project of the scoundrels, that might be too easy. And that brings me to the final point. I wonder why the book doesn't reflect on the effects of the solutions that it offers. It offers a lot of what I would call conditionality type of solutions, legalistic type of solutions.
What type of solutions?
I said conditionality grounded forms of solutions, legalistic solutions, sanctions, that kind of stuff. But it seems that nobody is reflecting carefully on what happens if these solutions actually work. If the law and justice is, through these sanctions, etc., ousted from power, put in the historical dustbin, what happens to Polish society then? Where are those democratic forces that sustain that type of system that we would like to see in place and that we thought was in place until recent times. Okay, I'll stop here.
Excellent. Many thanks, Paul. I think, as I mentioned before, there's plenty of food for thought. I would like to remind briefly the audience that we will soon move on to the Q&A. So please do send us your questions. And now, Professor Sadurski, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul, these have been extremely thoughtful and important remarks. I will not give justice to them because I want to leave as much space as possible for possible questions and comments. And I may say that I agree with many of the points you've made. When it comes to the historical aspect, the main burden of my historical chapter is that something that today, with the benefit of the hindsight, may seem like a deliberate project, in fact was very much based on contingent, specific conditions of the day, some small, pragmatic compromises, which are ununderstandable today, were perhaps the best solutions at the moment. And of course, mistakes were made. And the point that you've just made, that some groups were kept out of this consensus, that's a big point that Bruce Ackerman is making in the book that is about to appear now and in his chapter on Poland. The question is, was there any way of including them that wouldn't implode the whole compromise? In my view, there wasn't, but who knows? When it comes to the importance of civil society, again, you're right. I do not attach as much importance to it probably as I should have. Maybe it's to some extent colored by the fact that I was completing the book in late 2018 when the force of civil society was declining. And the Committee of Defense of Democracy, which you mentioned, to which I have been very much attached, with which I sympathize, for whom I appeared in various lectures, etc., was in decline and in a crisis. So, of course, I believe that in the end, civil society is very important and is much more vibrant than in Hungary. But at the same time, we see what you call uncivil society. We see social mobilization on the part of the conservatives. And who are we to say that they are worse than we are? They also mobilized society, but for the causes that I personally disagree with. So this is not a, if you like, field in which I'm very comfortable to carry on this discussion. When it comes to political constitutionalism, I certainly wouldn't attribute to you any attempt to associate a very noble theory of political constitutionalism with what is going on in Poland. I definitely not. If there is some fundamental prerequisite in political constitutionalism, is that it requires a working democracy, well-functioning checks and balances, and good separation of powers. None of that exists in Poland now, so there is no reason to identify political constitutionalism with today's Poland. And when it comes to the last point, sorry about not being able to develop everything. When it comes to the last point, that is to solutions, yes, I mainly look at legalistic solutions, at conditionality, at what the European Court of Human Rights can do, at what Polish courts can do, because I'm a lawyer. I believe that law has its role to play in finding remedies to the fundamental breakdown of democracy. But there's only so much that the law can do, and in the end it's up to the society and to the political will to bring back the democracy. If there is no sufficient political will in the society, no legal institutions will do it for the people. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much for all of those comments. Now, perhaps I can ask Paul if he has any additional thoughts that he wants to briefly bring into the discussion again, and then we will indeed move on to the Q&A session. So please do send us your questions. You have the great opportunity to engage with these two excellent speakers, so please don't miss it.
Okay, so.
Go ahead, Paul.
So maybe a final point could be, but that's a follow-up to what I've said before, is I started working on Central Eastern Europe with the idea of criticizing certain approaches that I called modernizationist and transitological. And to paraphrase Colin Crouch's book, I find it strange that there's a non-death of those theories. I mean, I feel that certain of the responses and the solutions that we formulate today are around similar ideas that we saw around in the 1990s. But we have to admit that in many cases, these transological dreams of consolidated democracies, etc., have not worked. So, yeah, that might be a further point to reflect upon. Why are we not able to go beyond formalistic, institutional, legalistic solutions? Well, one of the reasons probably is that because it's so extremely difficult. It's so extremely difficult to analyze, to get robust systematic knowledge of those social, cultural, political factors that underpin well-working constitutional democracy. So that might be a further point to reflect upon.
Excellent, thank you very much. I think we can move on to the first few questions, and perhaps first aspect that is mentioned by a couple of our audience members is, of course, the role of the European Union within this context of the story that you have outlined and discussed with Paul. In the first instance, we have Slawomira Miziak, who wonders how the election in autumn that will be held in Poland, as well as the changes that we're seeing within the European Union at the level of the European Commission and so on, what kind of impact will they have in the situation in Poland? And if I may add to this, is the EU dealing with Poland in a different way compared to how it dealt, for example, with Hungary in the past? Then we have a further question which relates to whether Poland is a sui generis case or whether in fact it's representative of trends that we can see occurring in other countries in the region. Obviously, Hungary is an example that is raised in that regard by both Johanna Speyer and Belen Betrel. And finally, we have Petra Bard, who is, of course, one of the investigators of our Reconnect project, who expresses solidarity with Professor Sadurski with regard to the legal harassment that we mentioned at the beginning, and wonders what is the role of academics in dismantling the rule of law, referring in particular to the disciplinary action that was initiated against you back in Poland by one of your peers. I think we can begin with this. Professor Sadurski, you may go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let me just very briefly start with more on a personal note. Thank you very much, Petra Bard, for your kindness and for your support. The support of my colleagues all over the world is very important for me. I believe that the role of academic lawyers in Poland is extremely high and extremely positive. There are very, very few people who have lost their independence and integrity. And by and large, I believe that Polish legal academia is highly committed to values of democracy and values of constitutionalism. Now, coming to the earlier point, and there are 2 points. What are my predictions for the elections in autumn, parliamentary elections, and the new commission? Who knows? I'm not a prophet. I don't know what will happen. I believe that when it comes to the parliamentary elections, which are all important elections in Poland, which are not just regular elections like in any democracy when we vote on the basis of policy on important issues, such as immigration, healthcare, or education. But this time, this will be the election about what sort of political system we shall have in Poland, whether we will consolidate current authoritarianism or we will return to an imperfect and yet liberal, rights protective democracy. That's the main dilemma there. I have no idea. I have no idea what will happen. I refuse to go along with the pessimism that many of my colleagues are overwhelmed with, because I just hate the possible self-fulfilling prophecy occurring in Poland. I don't know. I just know that the stake is extremely high. I also have absolutely no way of knowing what will be the new commission. Maybe without Junckers, maybe without Timmermans in particular. What I do know is that the Court of Justice of the European Union, which is relatively resilient towards political changes in the European Parliament and the European Commission, has a large number of cases in its pipeline, some of them coming from preliminary reference from Polish judges, some of them coming from the current commission. They touch the very central issues, just like yesterday's decision which concerned the purge in the Supreme Court. There are cases about the National Council of Judiciary, and there are cases about disciplinary actions against Polish judges, and there are cases about the about the purge in common courts. So I do hope that these legal actions will develop and that they will have a positive outcome. But let me just make a general declaration. I believe that European Union will not bring back democracy and rule of law to Poland. All it can do is to help provide additional legal resources and arguments to Polish Democrats. Poles have to restore democracy to Poland. It will not come from Brussels. It will not come from Luxembourg. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these first replies. Paul, do you have any additional thoughts?
Well, I just thought maybe the point made on Poland being a sui generis case or not is an interesting one, I would say. I personally would reply yes and no. It's both its own internal trajectory that has led to these developments. It's to be scrutinized carefully, but I don't think it's standing on its own. I mean, it seems to me, and I think Wojciech knows that part of my work, the sort of dimensions that I call legal resentment or legal skepticism, you see that all over the place. You see that in the Netherlands, you see that in the UK, you see it in Italy, and even over the globe. And so my view would be that there are also very important changes in how we understand constitutional democracy going on, and they're not necessarily very happy changes. We might need to reflect on that indeed further.
Yeah, let me just make one point, if I may, Alex, because sorry, I have ignored this issue about whether Poland is special, and I fully agree with Paul. In some ways, it is special. In some way, it is not. It is not because it's just one of the manifestations of this populism, this purely majoritarian approach to the democracy, and an idea that the winner takes all. But it's in some ways special, even compared to Hungary. And that is that Hungary managed, unfortunately or fortunately, to change its constitution and to bring about a number of entrenching various illiberal solutions. This option was not available to Jarosław Kaczyński in Poland. He didn't have constitutional majority. So when Viktor Orban proceeded lege artis by changing the constitution, Kaczyński proceeded contra legem, to use Latin maxims, that is by violating and breaching the constitution. I think it makes a very big difference. It makes a big difference even in terms of capacity for the EU reaction to it, because it's much more difficult for the EU to intervene in Hungary and tell them, look, we don't like your democracy, to which Hungarians may answer, but who are you to tell us what democracy we should opt, as opposed to Poland, where the EU may say, look, we believe that you act contrary to your own constitution. And that makes a difference. That's why Polish case is run in terms of the rule of law violation. That's where the rule of law framework was first established, and that's where Article 7 was first initiated. With Hungary, it's much more difficult. It's still run. I know that Article 7 is now has been activated by the European Parliament towards Hungary, but somehow telling a society we changed its constitution in a way which we don't like, it's a qualitatively different case from telling the society, you, the power elite, is breaching your own constitution, and this is so much against the even more minimalistic terms of the rule of law that we have in the European Union. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you both for this. We have some additional questions. First of all, Christian Surbar wonders to what extent corruption is a key driver of a lot of the challenges that we see in Poland, and to what extent are the members of the judiciary also affected by this. Perhaps I can quote Barbara Grabowska-Moritz, who asks, are there any positive political or social outcomes of the ongoing crisis in Poland, something that would give hope for the future? From Barbara.
Paul, do you want to start?
I have a couple of more questions.
Okay, go on.
And I will give you back the floor. Joanna Speyer once again asked, well, if the EU perhaps has not such a great role in the future of Poland and its return to the rule of law and democracy, did it play a role in triggering or deepening the Polish constitutional revolution? Perhaps we can start with these questions.
Okay, let me pick up those 3 points about corruption. You know, I'm not going to talk about Hungary because the matter is quite obvious. Hungary is a mafia state, and it is based on an oligarchy and the synergy between the political elite of Orban and his oligarchs. We always thought in Poland that we are somehow different. You know, Jarosław Kaczyński may be deplorable for all sorts of reasons, but at least he's a paragon of honesty and he doesn't care about money, etc. And the last year or so has shown that it is totally wrong, that he has built a big class of oligarchy around him, and month after month we get new scandals Another issue is how these scandals affect his political support. An answer is they do not. But that is something for political sociologists to understand. The thing is, there is a huge corruption in Poland, and that may show that probably every authoritarian regime, where there are no checks and balances, and when there is no separation of powers, must end up with huge corruption, because basically there are no guardians. There is no one to control it. To Barbara Grabowska-Moros, best regards and best greetings. Is there anything positive coming from the current political crisis in Poland? For me, not. It is, for me, unqualifiedly bad, tragic development. I wish I could say, yeah, we lawyers, we political scientists can learn certain lessons, but you know, because you, Barbara, and me are part of Polish society, Polish citizenship, we don't want our fellow citizens to undergo this type of experiments. And finally, Joanna, has EU contributed in any way to Polish constitutional crisis? No, I don't think it has greatly helped in finding remedies for reasons I had mentioned before, but the very act of joining European Union for me was an unqualifiedly positive phenomenon, and I wouldn't blame the EU on any aspects of Polish crisis. We deserve ourselves what is happening to us, and we cannot blame any foreign agents for that. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of our webinar. Perhaps I can feed into the discussion another couple of questions, leave the both of you with your final remarks, and then we will bring it to a close. We have again Christian Sorbara that specifies the issue of corruption with regard to the judiciary, and not only at the political level, and if that has particular implications, let's say. We have Ellen Hinsey, who asks whether, Professor Sadurski, you could elaborate further on the legacy of post-communism and the single-party state in Poland within this context. And finally, Robert Medzik asks whether, as a result of the elections in autumn, the constitution in Poland, which, as you've mentioned, constitutes a bulwark against backsliding, whether it might be changed in order to reflect the goals of the Law and Justice Party. Please, go ahead.
Me or Paul?
You may start, and then we go back to Paul.
Okay, very briefly. So, yes, when it comes to corruption in the judiciary, according to all the surveys and all the studies, it's certainly not higher or lower than the average European. It has been beefed up by governmental propaganda, but governmental propaganda focused on some totally isolated incidents. They managed to find 4 or 5 cases. There are 10,000 common judges in Poland. So it is just ridiculous to say that what the Law and Justice has done to Polish judiciary has been in any way triggered or justified by corruption of the judiciary. When it comes to the legacy of communism, indeed, this is something that Paul had elaborated at the very beginning, and I didn't mention. I believe that it's very true. There is such a thing as path dependence, and there is such a thing as the issue of certain mental habits and customs of people like Jarosław Kaczynski, who think in terms of the unity of powers and who simply believe that separation of powers is a sign of weakness and incapacity of the state. And finally, will, after the elections in autumn, current power elite be able to change change the constitution? Well, if they get constitutional majority, they certainly will. My own personal theory is they don't care about it all that much because they learned the ways of breaching the current constitution, so they can achieve exactly the same results without all the troubles of the new constitution. But of course, since they want to follow Orban, they probably will do it if they only can.
Thank you very much for that. Paul, some concluding thoughts. So sorry, we couldn't hear you. You're back
okay,
live now. Okay,
yeah, I see. I thought it would be best to end on a happy note. I normally don't do that, but it might leave us with a nicer taste in the mouth. Positive outcomes in the sense of, if we broaden up the scope a little bit, it seems to me that the fact that, as I mentioned before, in countries like Czechia and Romania, there are large public outcries against widespread corruption. The PSD in Romania is a case in point where the government tries to change the law so as to keep its own politicians out of prison. The public outcry against that, I think, is very interesting as a phenomenon, and it should give us some hope. I mean, Romania has nothing of the dissident traditions that Poland has. And if you look at social movement literature, certain repertoires do persist over time in many cases. And so I know Wojciech is right that there is a kind of waning importance of resistance, bottom-up resistance to the Polish project currently, but I have great hopes that this might be returned, maybe in combination with other forces of resistance, like including the courts, Human Rights Watch, and so on and so forth. So I do hope this is not yet the end of it. I sincerely hope that.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this final positive note. And thank you to all that have joined us today. This is all the time that we have. I would like to thank our speakers, Professor Wojciech Sadurski and Professor Paul Blokker, for taking part in this webinar. Before leaving you, I would like to announce the future Reconnect activities. The summer hiatus now begins for our Reconnect webinar series, but we will be back after the break with a webinar on democracy's advantage in managing threats of political violence, which will take place on the 16th of September with Professor Amichai Magen from the Herzliya University in Israel. If you're in the Brussels area, on the 5th of July, we are organizing our yearly Reconnect conference, where we will have the honor to welcome, among others, Professor Cohen Lennertz, President of the European Court of Justice, Professor Dan Kellerman, Professor Alberto Lemano, Professor Laurent Pech, and Petra Bard, as well as, of course, Professor Paul Blokker. For further information, please visit our website at reconnect-europe.eu. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us again next time. From Wojciech, Paul, and myself, thank you and goodbye.